In a peaceful suburban neighborhood, James and Michelle Washington found their retirement dream home, but their new neighbor had other plans. When Harold Peterson began his campaign of harassment against the retired black couple, he thought he could drive them away. The parking violations, the noise complaints, the vandalism, the assault. What Harold didn't know was who their son really was. Marcus Washington wasn't just any police officer, he was the chief of police. Now the tables have turned as justice finally arrives in Oak Ridge Estates. A community stands together against hatred. A family refuses to be intimidated. And a racist neighbor learns the consequences of his actions. Do you think Harold deserved the legal consequences he faced for his harassment? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served. The moving truck rumbled down Maple Avenue at 9 a.m. on a bright Saturday morning in May, followed by a modest sedan carrying James and Michelle Washington. After 30 years in their previous home, they had finally taken the plunge into a new chapter of their lives. The quaint suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge Estates represented everything they had worked toward, a peaceful retirement community with tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes. James, a 65-year-old retired high school English teacher with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, steered their car into the driveway of 1478 Maple Avenue. He glanced over at Michelle, his wife of 40 years, and squeezed her hand. "We made it," he said, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. Michelle, 63, returned his smile. After decades as a hospital nurse supervisor, she'd scaled back to part-time work at a local clinic. "It's everything we saved for," she replied, taking in the red brick colonial with its neatly trimmed hedges and wide front porch. As they stepped out of the car, several neighbors emerged from their homes. A middle-aged couple crossed the street to introduce themselves. "Welcome to Oak Ridge, I'm Linda Matthews and this is my husband, Paul. We're right across the street at 1479, the woman said, extending her hand. "James Washington," he replied, shaking her hand warmly. "This is my wife, Michelle." "We've got a welcome basket for you," Paul offered. "Nothing fancy, just some local coffee, bread from the bakery downtown, and information about the neighborhood." "That's incredibly thoughtful," Michelle said, genuinely touched. Within minutes, two more neighbors appeared, the Garcias from next door and an elderly woman named Dorothy who lived 2 houses down. Each offered warm welcomes and small tokens, a potted plant, a homemade pie, recommendations for local services. As James chatted with the neighbors, Michelle noticed a man standing on the porch of the house to their right. Unlike the others, he made no move to introduce himself. Instead, he watched the proceedings with narrowed eyes, arms crossed over his chest. When he caught Michelle looking, he turned and went inside, closing his door firmly. "Don't mind Harold Peterson," Dorothy whispered to Michelle. "He keeps to himself mostly. Been here longer than any of us, about 20 years now." The moving crew began unloading furniture, and the neighbors dispersed after extracting promises from the Washingtons to attend the monthly neighborhood cookout the following weekend. By late afternoon, most of their belongings were inside, though boxes remained stacked in every room. Michelle was arranging kitchen items when her phone rang. "Hi, Mom," came the deep voice of their son Marcus. "Marcus, we were just talking about you," Michelle said, putting the phone on speaker so James could hear. "How's the move going?" Marcus asked. "Smooth so far," James replied. "The neighbors seem wonderful. When are you coming to see the place?" "Soon, I hope. Things are hectic at work, as usual." At 38, Marcus Washington had built an impressive career in law enforcement. Though they spoke weekly, his visits were rare due to his demanding position. "We understand," Michelle said, though she missed him dearly. "Just don't be a stranger." "I won't," Marcus promised. "Love you both." After hanging up, James and Michelle decided to take a break on their new front porch. The evening air was pleasant, and most neighbors had retreated indoors for dinner. "I think we're going to be happy here," James said, sipping from a water bottle. Michelle nodded. "It feels right." Their moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of a lawn mower starting up. They looked over to see Harold Peterson begin mowing his already immaculate lawn, shooting occasional glances their way. "Seems like an odd time to mow," James remarked. "Maybe he works during the day," Michelle offered. Harold mowed in precise lines, his posture rigid. When he reached the property line between their homes, he stopped, staring at the moving boxes the crew had left by the Washingtons' garage for disposal. His expression soured as he turned off his mower. "Welcome to the neighborhood," James called, raising his hand in greeting. Harold looked directly at them for the first time, his gaze lingering before he gave a curt nod and wheeled his mower back toward his garage without a word. "Well," Michelle said quietly, "I guess we can't win everyone over on the first day." James squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Give it time, we've got plenty of it now." As twilight settled over Oak Ridge Estates, the Washingtons retreated inside to continue unpacking. Through their kitchen window, Michelle could see Harold's silhouette watching their home from his own darkened window. A slight chill ran up her spine, but she dismissed it, focusing instead on the warm welcome they'd received from everyone else. Tomorrow would be another day in their new beginning. 3 days after moving in, James was in the front yard on Tuesday morning, carefully arranging native plants in a small garden bed. Michelle had gone to work at the clinic, leaving him to continue settling into their new home. The sun warmed his back as he knelt in the soft soil, enjoying the simple pleasure of working with his hands. The sound of footsteps on the sidewalk made him look up. Harold Peterson was approaching, dressed in pressed khakis and a polo shirt despite the warm weather. His thin lips were set in a tight line as he stopped at the edge of the Washingtons' property. "Morning," James said pleasantly, standing and wiping his hands on his gardening pants. Harold didn't return the greeting. Instead, he gestured at the garden bed. "What exactly are you doing there?" James smiled, though he noted the confrontational tone. "Just putting in some native flowering plants. Michelle and I are big believers in supporting local pollinators." Harold's eyes narrowed. "This neighborhood has standards, you know. People here take pride in maintaining traditional landscaping." "I understand," James replied calmly. "These are all drought-resistant species that will look beautiful once established. The Neighborhood Association guidelines didn't mention any restrictions on native plants." "Guidelines don't cover everything about maintaining the character of a community," Harold said, emphasizing the word character in a way that made James pause. "Some things are just understood by people who belong here." The implication hung in the air between them. James took a deep breath, maintaining his composure despite the clear message. "Well, I appreciate your concern. Michelle and I researched this neighborhood carefully before buying. We're looking forward to being good neighbors and contributing positively to the community," Harold scoffed. "That remains to be seen." He crossed his arms and looked pointedly at the Washington home. "Your trash cans were visible from the street yesterday." "Yes, it was collection day," James explained patiently. "They're supposed to be brought in by 7 p.m. on collection day. Yours were still out at 7:30. James raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware of that specific timeline. Thank you for letting me know. There are lots of rules here," Harold continued. "Written and unwritten, you might find you'd be more comfortable in a different type of neighborhood." The statement landed like a stone. James stood straighter, meeting Harold's gaze directly. "My wife and I are quite comfortable here, thank you. We've been welcomed warmly by everyone else." "Everyone's polite at first," Harold said dismissively. "Look, I've lived here 20 years. I've seen how quickly property values can drop when the neighborhood changes." James felt a familiar weight settle in his chest when he'd carried through decades of similar conversations, always veiled, always deniable. "I assure you, Mr. Peterson, Michelle and I are committed to maintaining our property beautifully. We've owned homes for 40 years without issue." "It's not just about property maintenance," Harold said, lowering his voice despite no one else being nearby. "It's about fit, cultural fit. You understand what I'm saying?" James understood perfectly. He'd faced this countless times throughout his career as one of the few black teachers at his school. He'd learned long ago that responding with anger only reinforced stereotypes. "Mr. Peterson," he said evenly, "I believe I do understand what you're implying. I choose to believe you'll come to see us as the neighbors we are, respectful, quiet, and invested in this community's well-being." Harold snorted. "We'll see about that." He turned to leave but added over his shoulder, "And keep your music down. We don't appreciate styles around here." "We haven't played any music since moving in," James replied, his voice still measured despite his rising frustration. "Just keep it that way," Harold said before walking back to his own home. James watched him go, then slowly returned to his gardening, though the joy had leached from the activity. From their kitchen window, Michelle had witnessed part of the exchange. She came outside, concern written across her face. "What was that about?" she asked, setting down her purse. She'd returned home early for lunch to check on James. James sighed. "Our neighbor Mr. Peterson was expressing some concerns about us fitting into the neighborhood." Michelle's expression hardened. "What kind of concerns?" "The usual kind," James replied quietly. "Nothing we haven't heard before." Michelle knelt beside him, helping to plant the remaining flowers. "I thought we were past this, especially at our age in a neighborhood like this." People will never be past it," James said, his hands working methodically in the soil. "But we've dealt with worse. We won't let one person spoil this for us." As they worked together, James noticed Harold watching from his window. He gave a small wave, but Harold let the curtain fall, disappearing from view. "Should we tell Marcus?" Michelle asked quietly. James shook his head. "Not yet. He's got enough on his plate. This is probably nothing, just an unpleasant neighbor. Every neighborhood has one." Michelle nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "I hope you're right." "Me too," James said, looking toward Harold's house. "Me too." A week passed since James and Harold's confrontation in the front yard. The Washingtons had settled into a routine, spending mornings unpacking and afternoons exploring their new neighborhood. They'd attended the community cookout as promised and met more neighbors, all of whom had been welcoming. On Monday morning, James backed out of his driveway to run errands when he noticed something unusual. Harold's silver SUV was parked on the street, partially blocking the Washingtons' driveway. James had to maneuver carefully to avoid hitting it but managed to get out. When he returned 2 hours later, the SUV was still there. James parked in the remaining space of his driveway and walked next door. He knocked politely on Harold's door, waiting patiently until it opened. "Mr. Peterson," James began cordially, "I noticed your vehicle is partially blocking our driveway. Would you mind moving it?" Harold leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed. "I'm parked legally on a public street." "Yes, but it makes it difficult for us to enter and exit our driveway safely," James explained. "There's plenty of room in front of your house." Harold shrugged. "You seem to have managed fine just now. The street parking is first come, first served." "I understand that," James said, maintaining his composure. "I'm simply asking as a neighbor for a small courtesy." "You people are always so sensitive," Harold muttered, just loud enough for James to hear. "Fine, I'll move it when I'm ready." James took a deep breath. "Thank you, I appreciate it." The SUV remained there all day. By evening, Michelle had to park on the street when she returned from work. At 9 p.m., they heard Harold's car start up. He drove it into his garage without acknowledging them. The next morning, the pattern repeated. This time, Harold's car was positioned even more obtrusively. "This is deliberate," Michelle said as they ate breakfast, watching through their kitchen window as Harold left his house, pointedly ignoring his poorly parked vehicle. "I know," James replied, "but we need to handle this carefully." Michelle nodded, though frustration lined her face. "I've started documenting everything, times, dates, photos." "Good thinking," James said, squeezing her hand. That evening, as the Washingtons relaxed in their living room, a sharp knock came at their door. James opened it to find a police officer standing on their porch. "Good evening, sir," the officer said. "I'm Officer Collins. We received a noise complaint from one of your neighbors." James blinked in surprise. "A noise complaint? We've been watching TV at a normal volume." The officer shrugged. "I'm just responding to the call. Try to keep it down, all right." As the officer turned to leave, James spotted Harold watching from his porch with a satisfied smirk. Over the next 5 days, the pattern continued. Harold would park partially blocking their driveway. When asked politely to move his vehicle, he would respond with thinly veiled racist comments about the Washingtons being too sensitive or not understanding how things work around here. 3 more noise complaints were filed, all during times when the Washingtons were either reading quietly or watching TV at a reasonable volume. Each time, different officers responded, and each time Harold would watch the proceedings from his window. On Saturday morning, James was checking their mail when he noticed Sarah Chen, a neighbor from across the street, walking her dog. "Good morning, James," she called. "How are you settling in?" "Morning, Sarah. We're doing well, though we've had some challenges with our neighbor," he said, nodding slightly toward Harold's house. Sarah lowered her voice. "Harold, he's been difficult with others before, especially with the Rodriguez family when they lived in your house. They moved out after 6 months." "I see," James said, filing this information away. "He seems to have an issue with us being here." Sarah hesitated before responding. "He's made comments at neighborhood meetings about maintaining community standards. Most of us just ignore him. Let me know if there's anything I can do." "Thank you, Sarah. We're just trying to handle things peacefully." That afternoon, James and Michelle discovered large landscaping rocks placed at the edge of their driveway, making it even harder to navigate around Harold's still improperly parked car. "These weren't here yesterday," Michelle said, examining the rocks, "and they're definitely on our property." James took photos, adding them to their growing documentation. "This has gone beyond passive-aggressive," he said quietly. Michelle's phone rang. It was their son Marcus calling for their weekly check-in. "Everything okay, Mom?" Marcus asked after Michelle's unusually brief greeting. "Just some neighbor troubles," she said, trying to sound casual. "What kind of troubles?" Marcus asked, his professional instincts clearly activated. "Nothing we can't handle," James interjected, though he exchanged a look with Michelle that suggested they were both becoming less certain of that. As they spoke with Marcus, Harold emerged from his house and began hosing down his driveway, intentionally spraying water across the property line onto the Washingtons' newly planted garden. "We should go, honey," Michelle said to Marcus. "We'll talk more next week." After hanging up, James took a deep breath. "This isn't going to resolve itself, is it?" Michelle shook her head, watching Harold through the window. "No, I don't think it is." The situation with Harold reached its tipping point on a Wednesday morning in early June. Michelle had left for work at 7 a.m. and James was enjoying his morning coffee on the front porch, reading the newspaper. The temperature was pleasant, birds were singing, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. That tranquility shattered when the sound of scraping metal caught James's attention. He looked up to see Harold dragging several large landscaping boulders, each at least 50 pounds, across the sidewalk toward the Washingtons' driveway entrance. James set down his coffee and newspaper, approaching Harold with measured steps. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson. May I ask what you're doing?" Harold straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Neighborhood beautification project." he replied curtly, positioning a boulder at the edge of the Washingtons' driveway. The stone was placed in such a way that it would make entering their driveway nearly impossible. Those boulders are blocking access to my property, James pointed out, keeping his voice level despite his rising blood pressure. They're on the easement, which is public property, Harold countered, shifting another large rock into place. The community association is concerned about soil erosion. James looked around. I don't see any other driveways with boulders placed like this. Yours is a priority area, Harold said with a smirk. Besides, careful drivers shouldn't have any problem navigating around them. Mr. Peterson, James said firmly, please remove these rocks. They're clearly positioned to obstruct our driveway. Harold stood up, facing James directly. Make me. The challenge hung in the air between them. James, who had spent decades teaching high school students, recognized the childish taunt for what it was, an attempt to provoke him into behaving in a way that would reinforce Harold's prejudices. This has gone far enough, James said quietly. We've tolerated your car blocking our driveway, false noise complaints, and water damage to our garden, but this is dangerous and possibly illegal. You people always claim victimhood, Harold sneered, his voice rising. If you can't handle living in a decent neighborhood, maybe you should go back to wherever you came from. Across the street, Sarah Chen had emerged from her house and was watching the confrontation with concern. She discreetly took out her phone and began recording. I'm from Detroit, Mr. Peterson, James replied calmly. And before that, my family came from Georgia, and before that, South Carolina. We've been in this country for generations, just like your family, I imagine. You know what I mean, Harold spat, his face reddening with anger. Your kind doesn't belong here. This neighborhood was perfect before you showed up. James took a deep breath. I'm going to have to ask you one more time to remove these rocks, and then I'll need to call the authorities. Go ahead, Harold shouted, gesturing wildly. My brother-in-law is a sergeant with the department. Let's see who they believe, me, a taxpayer for 20 years, or you who just showed up. James pulled out his phone to call the police. As he did, Harold grabbed the last boulder and deliberately placed it directly in the center of the driveway entrance. Mr. Peterson, please stop, James said firmly. Or what? Harold challenged, stepping closer to James, invading his personal space. What are you going to do about it? When James didn't back down, Harold gave him a hard shove that sent the older man stumbling backward. James managed to catch himself before falling, but his phone clattered to the ground. James, are you okay? Sarah called out, hurrying across the street toward them, still recording. Harold whirled around, surprised to discover they had an audience. Mind your own business, Sarah. I saw what you just did, Sarah said, helping James steady himself. That was assault. Harold's face contorted with rage. He was threatening me. We all have security cameras, Sarah replied, pointing to various houses on the street. And I've been recording since you started moving those rocks. James picked up his phone, which thankfully wasn't damaged, and completed his call to the police. 20 minutes later, a patrol car arrived. Officer Diaz stepped out and surveyed the scene. What seems to be the problem here? He asked, looking between James and Harold. Both men started speaking at once, but Officer Diaz held up his hand. One at a time, please. Harold launched into his version first, claiming James had threatened him and that the rocks were part of a community beautification project. When it was James's turn, he explained the ongoing harassment calmly, showing Officer Diaz the photos they'd been documenting and mentioning the repeated noise complaints. He physically pushed me, James concluded. Ms. Chen witnessed it and has video. Sarah nodded, stepping forward with her phone. Officer Diaz viewed the video, his expression remaining neutral. After speaking with both parties, he turned to Harold. Sir, I'm going to need you to remove these rocks immediately. This is ridiculous, Harold protested. Don't you know who my brother-in-law is? I don't care if your brother-in-law is the police commissioner, Officer Diaz replied firmly. These rocks are creating a hazard and need to be removed. Now, seething with anger, Harold began moving the boulders back to his yard. Do you want to press charges for the assault, Mr. Washington? Officer Diaz asked quietly. James hesitated, then nodded. Yes, this has to stop. The day after the confrontation, James and Michelle sat at their kitchen table surrounded by documentation, photographs of Harold's improperly parked vehicles, timestamps of noise complaints, notes about their interactions, and Sarah's video of the physical assault. Michelle had taken the day off work to deal with the aftermath. I can't believe it had to come to this, James sighed, organizing the papers into a folder. All we wanted was to retire peacefully. Michelle reached across the table and squeezed his hand. We've done everything right, James. We've been patient, professional, and restrained. Now we need to protect ourselves. The police had filed a report about the assault, but Officer Diaz had quietly warned them that such cases were often considered low priority. Harold's connections within the department complicated matters further. We need a multi-pronged approach, Michelle said, her years as a nursing supervisor evident in her strategic thinking. Legal protection, community support, and official documentation. James nodded. I spoke with Linda and Paul this morning. They've had their own issues with Harold in the past, but nothing this severe. Sarah called while you were meeting with them, Michelle replied. 3 other neighbors have security footage showing Harold moving those rocks. They're willing to share the footage if needed. At 10 a.m., Michelle's phone rang. It was Diane Walker, her colleague from the clinic and a longtime friend. Michelle, how are you holding up? Diane asked. We're managing, Michelle replied, though I never expected to be dealing with something like this at our age. Listen, my brother-in-law David is a civil rights attorney. He specializes in housing discrimination and harassment cases. Would you like his number? That would be incredibly helpful, Michelle said, grabbing a pen. After getting David's contact information, Michelle made the call immediately. To their relief, David agreed to meet with them that afternoon. At 2 p.m., David Morgan arrived at their home, a distinguished black man in his 50s with a confident demeanor and kind eyes. He reviewed their documentation methodically, asking occasional clarifying questions. You've done an excellent job documenting everything, David commented, reviewing the folder. Most people don't think to keep such detailed records. We've learned from experience, James said quietly. David nodded in understanding. Based on what I'm seeing, we have several potential legal avenues. The assault is clear-cut, but there's also a pattern of harassment and potentially discriminatory behavior. What do you recommend? Michelle asked. First, we file for a restraining order based on the assault. That gives you immediate protection. Second, we prepare a civil case addressing the pattern of harassment. Third, I'd like to investigate whether Harold has a history of this behavior with other minority residents. James frowned. Sarah mentioned a family named Rodriguez who lived here before us. Apparently they moved out after 6 months. David made a note. I'll look into that. If we can establish a pattern targeting minorities, that strengthens our case significantly. While they were talking, the doorbell rang. Michelle answered it to find Linda Matthews and 3 other neighbors standing on their porch. We heard what happened, Linda said. We want you to know the neighborhood stands with you. Michelle invited them in and they joined the discussion around the kitchen table. Each neighbor shared their own experiences with Harold's subtle comments, property disputes, exclusion from neighborhood events. He's been a problem for years, said Tom Garcia, who lived 2 doors down, but most of us just tried to avoid him. Not anymore, Linda declared firmly. This has gone too far. By 4 p.m., they had developed a comprehensive plan. David would begin legal proceedings immediately. The neighbors would provide written statements and any available security footage. James and Michelle would continue documenting any further incidents. As their neighbors departed, Michelle's phone rang again. It was Marcus, their son. Mom, Dad mentioned something about neighbor trouble yesterday. Is everything okay? Michelle hesitated, exchanging glances with James. They had always tried to avoid burdening their son with their problems. We're handling it, she replied carefully. That's not an answer, Marcus said, his tone serious. What's going on? James took the phone. Son, we've had some issues with a neighbor who doesn't seem to want us here. It escalated to a minor physical confrontation yesterday. Physical confrontation? Marcus's voice sharpened. Are you both okay? We're fine, James assured him. We've filed a police report and just met with an attorney. The community is supporting us. There was a long pause on the line. I want more details, Marcus finally said, and I think it's time I came for a visit. I've got some vacation days saved up. After they hung up, James looked at Michelle. I didn't want to involve him in this. He deserves to know, Michelle said softly, and maybe it's good timing. We could use some family support right now. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Harold drove past their house slowly, glaring at them before pulling into his driveway. Despite the restraining order process being initiated, they knew this conflict was far from over. Do you think we should have just moved somewhere else? James asked quietly. Michelle shook her head firmly. No, this is our home now, and we're not going to be driven away by hatred, not at our age, not after everything we've been through. James squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her determination. You're right, we stand our ground. 1 week after the confrontation, Marcus Washington's police cruiser pulled into his parents' driveway at 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. At 42, Marcus cut an imposing figure as he stepped out of the vehicle, tall and athletic in his crisp uniform, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. James and Michelle rushed to the front door, embracing their son tightly. It's so good to see you, Michelle said, her voice thick with emotion. Though I wish it were under better circumstances. Marcus smiled warmly at his parents. Me too, Mom, but I'm glad I'm here now. Inside, Marcus reviewed all the documentation they had collected, his expression growing increasingly serious with each photo and incident report. As a law enforcement professional with 20 years of experience, he recognized the pattern immediately. This is textbook harassment and intimidation, he said finally, closing the folder. And the department's response has been inadequate. Officer Diaz did the right thing, but the follow-up should have been more thorough. We understand the police have many priorities, James said diplomatically. Marcus shook his head. Not when it comes to citizen safety, Dad, that's always the priority. A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Michelle answered to find David Morgan, their attorney, standing on the porch. "David, please come in," she said. "Our son Marcus is visiting." As David entered the living room, he extended his hand to Marcus. "Pleased to meet you, Marcus. Your parents have mentioned you're in law enforcement." Before Marcus could answer, movement outside caught their attention. Through the window, they saw Harold Peterson marching toward their house, his face contorted with anger. Despite the restraining order proceedings, Harold seemed determined to continue his harassment. "That's him," James said quietly. Marcus studied Harold through the window, his expression unreadable. "Let me handle this," he said, straightening his uniform jacket. "Marcus," Michelle began hesitantly. "Trust me, Mom," he assured her with a smile. "I'll follow proper procedures." Marcus stepped onto the front porch just as Harold reached the edge of their property. Seeing the police cruiser in the driveway, Harold faltered momentarily but then continued forward with renewed determination. "Another false complaint," Harold called out mockingly. "Your connections won't help you this time." Marcus descended the steps slowly, his posture professional and composed. Harold froze in place when he noticed the uniform, clearly expecting to see a regular patrol officer rather than a high-ranking officer. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said calmly. "I'm Chief Marcus Washington of the Oak Ridge County Police Department." Harold's jaw dropped. "Washington," he repeated, looking between Marcus and the house where James and Michelle now stood in the doorway. "Yes, sir. James and Michelle Washington are my parents," Marcus confirmed. "I understand there's been an ongoing situation here that requires attention." The color drained from Harold's face as the implications sank in. There must be some misunderstanding," he stammered. "I don't think so, Mr. Peterson," Marcus replied evenly. "I've reviewed substantial documentation regarding your interactions with my parents, including multiple witness statements and video evidence of assault." Harold took a step backward. "They're exaggerating. I was just trying to maintain neighborhood standards." "By physically assaulting a 65-year-old man?" Marcus asked, his voice remaining professional despite the clear anger in his eyes. "By filing false police reports, by deliberately blocking access to their property." "I never," Harold began. "Save it for court, Mr. Peterson," Marcus interrupted. "As chief of police, I take harassment of any citizen in my jurisdiction extremely seriously. The fact that the victims in this case are my parents means I'll be recusing myself from direct involvement in the investigation to avoid any conflict of interest." He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Captain Reynolds. I need a patrol unit at 1478 Maple Avenue to enforce a restraining order and possibly make an arrest for violation of said order." Harold's face contorted with disbelief. "You can't do this. I'm not doing anything except ensuring the law is properly enforced," Marcus replied calmly, "something that should have happened from the beginning." By now, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold. Sarah Chen approached, along with the Garcias and the Matthews. "Chief Washington," Sarah said, "we all have footage and statements about Mr. Peterson's behavior if you need additional evidence." "Thank you, Ms. Chen," Marcus replied professionally. "A detective will be in touch to collect all relevant information." Harold looked around at the gathering neighbors, the support for the Washingtons evident in their expressions. For perhaps the first time, he realized he stood alone. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Actually, Mr. Peterson," David Morgan said, stepping forward with legal papers in hand, "it is. Consider yourself served with both a restraining order and a civil lawsuit for harassment, discrimination, and assault." Within minutes, a patrol car arrived. The officers spoke briefly with Marcus before approaching Harold, who had retreated to the edge of the property. As Harold was escorted back to his own home with a formal warning about violating the restraining order, James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We didn't want to bother you with this," he said quietly. Marcus turned to his father, his professional demeanor softening. "Dad, you and Mom have spent your whole lives handling things on your own, protecting me. Maybe it's time I return the favor." From across the street, Linda Matthews called out, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Chief Washington. Will you be staying long?" Marcus smiled, looking at his parents. "Longer than I planned. I think my parents might need some help settling in." 2 weeks after Marcus's arrival, the Washingtons hosted a small gathering in their backyard. The warm Sunday afternoon brought together neighbors who had supported them throughout their ordeal with Harold. Sarah Chen brought homemade dumplings, the Garcias contributed empanadas, and the Matthews arrived with a large fruit salad. "I can't believe how quickly things have changed," Linda Matthews said, taking a seat beside Michelle. "Harold's house already has a for sale sign up." James nodded, passing around a tray of lemonade. "His attorney contacted David yesterday. They want to settle the civil suit out of court." The legal consequences for Harold had mounted quickly. Beyond the restraining order and civil lawsuit, he faced misdemeanor assault charges. More significantly, the investigation Marcus initiated had uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior extending back years. The Rodriguez family, who had lived in the Washingtons' house previously, provided statements about similar harassment that had driven them away. He won't be able to hide his history from future neighbors either, Tom Garcia added. The settlement includes mandatory disclosure of the legal issues if he sells his house. Marcus, who had extended his stay by an additional week, joined the conversation. The department has also implemented new training procedures based on this case. Officers are receiving additional guidance on recognizing and responding to potential bias-motivated harassment. It's remarkable how one person's hatred created positive change for an entire community, David Morgan observed, having been invited to the gathering as both attorney and new friend. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation shifted from Harold to more pleasant topics. The Washingtons shared stories from their careers, neighbors discussed upcoming community events, and plans were made for a neighborhood garden project. Around 4 p.m., Officer Diaz stopped by off-duty and in casual clothes. "Chief Washington invited me," he explained, offering James a firm handshake. "I wanted to personally apologize for not taking more decisive action during the initial incidents." "You were there when it mattered most," James assured him. "That made all the difference." The gathering continued into early evening, marked by laughter, shared food, and strengthened community bonds. As the sun began to set, Marcus called for everyone's attention. "I want to propose a toast," he said, raising his glass. "To my parents who have always faced adversity with dignity and grace, and to good neighbors who stand together against injustice." Glasses clinked as murmurs of agreement spread through the group. Michelle wiped away a tear, overwhelmed by the moment. After the guests departed, the Washington family sat together on their porch swing, watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. "I'm proud of how you handled all this," Marcus told his parents. "Many people would have either escalated the situation or simply moved away." "We're too old to run from problems," James replied with a small smile. "And too experienced to let anger guide our actions." Michelle leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. "We've always believed that standing your ground doesn't mean responding with equal hatred. It means maintaining your dignity while seeking proper justice." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's a lesson I've carried throughout my career. It's what made me want to become chief, to ensure justice is applied equally, regardless of who you are or where you come from." The following morning, as Marcus prepared to return to his own home, the three Washingtons stood in the driveway for final goodbyes. "You'll visit more often now?" Michelle asked, straightening her son's collar in a habit she'd never outgrown. "Definitely," Marcus promised. "This place feels like home already." "We're grateful for your help," James said, embracing his son. "But we want you to know we're okay now. You don't need to worry about us." Marcus smiled. "I know, Dad. You two have always been the strongest people I know." As Marcus drove away, James and Michelle walked hand in hand back to their front porch. Across the street, Sarah waved cheerfully while walking her dog. Next door, Harold's house stood empty, the for sale sign swaying gently in the breeze. "So," James said, settling into his favorite chair, "what shall we plant in the backyard garden plot? I was thinking tomatoes." Michelle laughed, the sound light and free. "Tomatoes it is, and maybe some peppers too." As they discussed their gardening plans, the weight of the previous weeks lifted fully from their shoulders. They had faced hatred and emerged stronger, surrounded by a community that had ultimately chosen unity over division. Their retirement home had finally become what they'd always hoped for, a place of peace, belonging, and new beginnings.